So in this section, we're going to be looking at the wetlands, the coasts, and the estuaries. So just like the flatlands, the wetlands are also flat, but they are different in the sense that you have roughly 50% water and 50% land. So although marshes can be quite productive, it is a very inconvenient landscape to have because you have watery kind of soil. So you have a very high water table. So what happens is when you dig down, you immediately get water coming up. And you need to put that material somewhere. So what you can do is when you dig down and you put the soil somewhere in a wet climate, what ends up happening is you end up with water in these holes and kind of like banks that come up. And when you do this, you end up kind of accentuating the land portions and accentuating the water portions. And you have basically just created a Chinampa system out of these wetlands. And as we know that Chinampas are the most productive systems ever documented. And they're often trellised with various types of trellises. So in these systems, we can very often have, that one really doesn't work that well. We can have trellises that go over top of the water in various fashions. Maybe it's a hoop, maybe it's a kind of a teepee style. There can be tree crops growing on the Chinampas themselves, on the mounds. There can be a bunch of plants on the edges that are all growing. There can be emergent plants on the edges as well. So there might be like cattails and things like that that are growing in between the water and the edges of the Chinampa system. These plants very often can be perennial or annual based on what's needed. And the harvesting is generally done by boat, where you end up having the boat kind of on these canals, and you can collect all of the produce from the trellises and from the sides of these mounds right into the boat. You can have the reason why it's harvested by boat too is that you can hold a tremendous amount of weight in the boat as opposed to in a wheelbarrow or something like that, especially when this is kind of really, really wet and saturated. If you try and wheelbarrow anything, it's just going to sink into the ground and be very difficult to push or pull or move around. And in these water systems that you've created, you can have crayfish and shrimp and fish and all sorts of protein sources in the water. You can have floating waterweed that can fertilize your banks when they flood. Because of the richness of this system, you'll also get fertile soil accumulating on the bottom of each of these water areas, which you can pull back out and place back up on top as well into the gardens. So these kind of systems work really well in hot climates like Vietnam and Mexico, and they can work in cold climates too. So an example of that would have been when the First Nations people would grow wild rice. They would do it in a kind of a similar system in cold climates, obviously not the trellises, but they would kind of accentuate again the wet areas and the dry areas to make the harvesting a little bit easier. So you can grow a lot of acid-loving plants in these kind of situations because, again, when soil is really, really wet, it tends to be more anaerobic, which tends to go more acidic. And so cranberries, blueberries, they do very well in this system. You can even grow willows to use as trellises as well because they love wet conditions. In a lot of climates, you can grow mulberries to use as trellises. You can grow grapes up the mulberries. You can actually infuse the mulberries with silkworms that can grow on the mulberry trellises. And then when the mulberries are ripe, you can shake the vines, and the mulberries and the silkworms will fall into the pond and feed the fish below. So there's so many different combinations of ways you can use these systems. And what makes it so productive is the fact that, just like an estuary, it has a lot of edges in this kind of a system. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to put in a Chinampa system when you have a wetland. It's just merely a way to think about this type of a landscape. Just because you have a wetland or a steep slope or you're on an island doesn't mean that your hands are tied. These are just some of the possibilities that you might have in those kinds of situations. If you have treed swales above you on a slope, and you've got sloped land that isn't in a wetland, you can actually create wetland type conditions. Because sometimes when people have had their sloped land swaled and put into production for a number of years, what happens is when the water is soaked into the landscape, sometimes it even springs up lower down in the landscape, and the landscape becomes so saturated that very often the swales downhill are always filled with water because there's so much water in the landscape that you can almost turn that downhill swale into a Chinampa-like system as well, because you have that water collection in the swale, you have the mound, which acts like this kind of a mound, and you can actually, even in a drier climate, actually produce this kind of a situation for yourself because they are such productive systems. So these are just some of the evolutions that we can experience when we have proper design. We can actually turn maybe a fairly dry landscape into something that produces like a Chinampa system simply by placing these swales all the way down the hillside. An example of something that's kind of similar but in a cold climate would be in Denmark. They have all the canals in Denmark, and they freeze thick enough that people can skate on them. And people tend to place their gardens on the edges of the canals in Denmark because that's where the soil is the most fertile. And just like here in Canada, people want to prep and be very ready for the springtime so that they can ensure that their garden is mulched and ready to go. So they spend a lot of their winter time thinking about springtime gardening and what they can do to be productive. So in Denmark, what they can do is, what happens when the water freezes on these canals is all the bulrushes are sticking out of the ice, and the tips are all sticking out. So what they can do is they can skate on the canal with a really sharp shovel, and they can scrape off all of those frozen bulrushes and then shovel them up onto their garden and use that as mulch. And this works so well because, of course, when plants freeze, they're also brittle and they come off really quite easily. And all of that mulch that you get from the bulrushes that's coming out of any sort of water production is very high in phosphate. None of these plants tend to grow on the land, but if we can combine the use of plants as mulch from a water producing system to use on land, then we just increase the amount of microorganisms and soil organisms and things that are going to be there, that are going to be present, and a lot of the minerals that our plants need are also going to get transferred in those kinds of systems. So that's another advantage of having a cold climate, is that things freeze. So we have those advantages. There's also glacial events that can happen along the same line. So if we think about how to use water in the wintertime, in some situations it might be beneficial to actually create rip lines that collect water, and then when the water freezes, it expands, and it will actually expand the earth and heave and crack it open so that more things can kind of penetrate the ground. So if you place the rip lines in the right place, right where the water infiltrates and then freezes and expands and creates large pockets in the soil, those can help collect minerals as well, because very often that water that collects in there has also picked up a bunch of dust and maybe insect pieces and things like that all go into these cracks and create a lot of nutrient that can get pushed down further into the ground than it normally would. So this brings us to the coasts and the estuaries. So just like I was talking about how the bulrushes and things in freshwater would have high contents of phosphates, you can also get a lot of that really good phosphate mulch from the ocean to work with. An example of that would be kelp in the cold climates. So all of the minerals of the ocean are in these big lengths of kelp, which washes up on the shore, which we can use as mulch as well. You also have seagrass in estuaries that can be used as mulch. Most estuaries are protected now by conservation status and things like that, so you can't really work on them, but you can help enhance the habitat or do things to produce marine aquaculture systems or shellfish systems. But we have to keep in mind when we do that estuaries are also the filtered endpoints of our systems. So you have to be very careful with the shellfish and things that might be pulled out of the estuaries, because they can pick up a lot of toxins from lead paints and antibiotics and so forth that all kind of gets filtered through there. And when we're looking at that phosphate production out of plants from water, one of the greatest products that comes out of the estuaries is seagrass. It comes out of shallow marine flats, and it molts once per year. And when it does this, it usually washes out into the ocean and then washes up onto the beaches. And this seagrass is extremely plentiful. You will not run out of seagrass. And it's also been used for building insulation, because once it dries up, it has a tendency to curl and create more volume that way. And it lasts hundreds of years because it has a very high silica content as well in it. So it makes fantastic mulch as well, because of its just prolific nature. You can have a lot of it. It's very neutral. It's very slow to break down. It doesn't have any of the seeds that can grow in our gardens, because when you use plants that were produced in water as mulch, they're not going to start suddenly popping up in your garden the same way as if you used maybe land-based plants on your land-based garden. And the seagrass also holds a ton of water. It's very absorbent as well. And if you did this right, you could actually trap hundreds of tons of seagrass in a healthy estuary. There is no shortage of seagrass out there. When we're looking at alkaline soils, one thing that we can use, so in Regina we have very alkaline soils. Most of them are between the 8 and 9 pH range. So it's really great for growing things like brassicas, so anything from the cabbage family. They love the alkaline soils, like we discussed before, with with them originating on beaches and things like that. They love that kind of soil. But if we want to amend that, then maybe a better mulch solution would be things like sawdust. And the sawdust can be used in the pathways in our gardens. And when it becomes compacted, it holds water so well that it almost becomes acidic. And that's great because it tends to kind of mix in with our already existing soils and neutralizes them, because most plants thrive in more neutral soils to slightly acidic. There are way fewer plants that actually prefer alkaline soils than plants that prefer acidic soils or neutral soils. On the coast, you typically have sandy soil, and it's hard to keep it from leaching. So on the flip side here, because what we have is really heavy clay soil, which is very alkaline, so we want to try and make it more acidic. But on the coast, you have very sandy soil, and the water just goes right through it because there's nothing to hold on to that water. So what you want to do is you want to set up very thick layers of newspaper or cardboard, and then put a bunch of compost and fertilizer on top of that to reduce some of that leaching effect. And mixing clay in with the sand is also very beneficial, but if you've ever tried to mix wet clay in with wet sand, you'll know that all you get is this sticky gumbo that's impossible to work with. Wet clay is awful to work with. So a better solution is to buy bags of dry bentonite. So it's like a powdered clay, and mix that into your sand because it mixes really, really easily but has the same kind of advantages. And once this clay is mixed into the sand, then the soil biology goes to work, and it tends to convert everything below into this thick, dark, beautiful loam. And really a lot of that is created without very much human effort. Like once you mix the bentonite in, and then you put these newspapers down and the fertilizer and the compost on top, it just kind of all mixes together itself and makes beautiful, beautiful soil. So the compost can be added as a fertilizer. When you had mixed in all of that bentonite clay into the sand, when you add in a little bit of compost as well, it acts as a bit of like an inoculant to help infuse life into your garden as well, so that the soil biology can take over and really start doing a bunch of that work for you. So conversely, if we have really heavy clay soils where the water does not drain, that's pretty much the only kind of soil I think I have on my property. Great for building, not so great for gardening in. Has a lot of minerals to it, and it's really productive soil. It's just that it doesn't drain well. So a lot of your plants kind of suffer from, having wet roots and wet feet, and they don't really love that. So what you can do when you have too heavy of clay soils is you can add sand into your clay soils to help have that water kind of drain through a little bit more effectively. Silica is very handy when you have a very windy coastal area. So bamboo leaves, seagrass, all those kind of things. Because silica actually helps your vegetation stand up to strong wind. So it's a really good thing to use as a mulch material in a very windy coastal area. So now we have our climates, our major, our minors, and our major and minor landscape profiles. So now when we move on, we're going to move on to energy in the landscape captured by trees. We're going to be looking at specific elements and how they work within each one of our designs.